I remember the moment I first heard about the Bear Brook murders. 4 bodies, 2 adults, and 2 children found in steel barrels near Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire. The discoveries took place years apart, first in the mid-1980s and then again at the dawn of the new millennium, sending shockwaves through the local community. Early reports described a gruesome scene, remains sealed away in large industrial-style barrels tucked out of sight in a wooded area. News outlets scarcely knew what to make of such a disturbing crime. Little did anyone realize at the time that these tragic losses would become a landmark example of how modern forensic genealogy can unravel even the coldest of cases. From the start, people whispered about who the victims might be, and many speculated whether a serial killer was on the loose. Officials conducted exhaustive searches, but the park's thick woods and dense undergrowth provided few additional clues. While local rumors circulated, one fact remained chillingly clear. 4 people had been callously left in one of New Hampshire's most picturesque settings. The case would haunt seasoned investigators for decades to come. It all began in the year 1985 when a local hunter, scouting near Bear Brook State Park, stumbled upon something bizarre: a large steel barrel resting in an out-of-the-way clearing. No one could guess what might be inside, but the hunter felt uneasy enough to report it to the authorities. Responding officers pried open the container and made a horrific discovery: 2 bodies, an adult woman and a young girl, sealed inside. The region was in shock. Bear Brook State Park had always been a favorite spot for outdoor enthusiasts, with families visiting its trails and campsites year-round. That such a brutal crime could occur here seemed unfathomable. At the time, investigators combed through missing persons databases, hoping to match the mother and child to someone's report, but came up empty-handed. Fingerprinting yielded no clear identification, and early DNA technology in the 1980s was not advanced enough to crack the case. Faced with little to go on, the trail went cold in record time. Still, the discovery left the local community deeply unsettled. It felt impossible that such a crime could occur without any witnesses or missing persons notices. Law enforcement maintained an active interest, but as months turned into years, fresh leads dried up. Despite the best efforts of investigators, the adult woman and the little girl remained unnamed, their deaths a grim mystery. 15 years later, in the year 2000, Bear Brook State Park once again became the backdrop for a horrifying revelation. This time, the gruesome discovery occurred a short distance from the original site, and it was all too familiar. A second steel barrel, nearly identical to the first, lay hidden in the thick brush. Inside, authorities uncovered the remains of 2 more young children. The news jolted the community back into a state of alarm. People who had long ago put the first murders out of mind were suddenly reminded that the killer had never been caught. Did this mean the perpetrator had struck again, or perhaps more disturbingly, had the bodies been there all along, undiscovered for more than a decade? Investigators quickly connected the new victims to the 1985 case. The circumstances were too similar to dismiss. Yet, once again, attempts to identify these children through missing persons databases led nowhere. It was as though they had never officially existed. This second discovery also raised an unsettling question. If 4 victims could remain unidentified for so long, just how many more crimes could be lurking under the radar? With the Bear Brook murders now encompassing 4 unidentified victims, 2 adults, 2 children, public anxiety rose to new heights. Families gripped their children's hands a little tighter when visiting state parks, and the press turned its spotlight back on the unsolved case. The puzzle seemed insurmountable: 4 mysterious victims, 0 clear suspects, and no obvious motive. Investigators would spend the next several years struggling to shed light on what became one of New Hampshire's most disturbing cold cases. Year after year, the 4 victims found near Bear Brook State Park remained nameless. Investigators wondered why no one had come forward, no parents, no siblings, no friends, desperate to know what could explain such enduring silence. One explanation was that the victims might have been estranged from their extended families, or perhaps their relatives simply did not know where to begin searching. Regardless of the reason, this lack of leads created a suffocating gridlock within the investigation. Throughout the late 1980s and into the 90s, detectives pored over every available missing persons report, from New Hampshire to states across the country, trying to find a match for the bodies discovered in the barrels. There was hope at first that perhaps a new report would come in, or a grieving relative would recognize a police sketch. Yet time slipped by without a single credible tip. Even meticulous searches of the state park, sometimes combing every hidden corner, turned up precious little. With nothing to go on, detectives felt they were chasing ghosts. Some officers who had once been assigned to the case eventually retired, passing the file to younger colleagues who, in turn, met the same dead ends. The Bear Brook murders drifted to the fringes of public awareness, remembered mostly by longtime residents who still shuddered at the thought of the steel barrels discovered in the woods. But even then, a persistent feeling lingered among law enforcement. The answers might be out there, waiting to be found. All it would take was the right breakthrough or the right technology. At the turn of the new millennium, law enforcement began to see glimpses of that much-needed breakthrough. In the early 2000s, a new generation of detectives stepped in to reinvestigate the Bear Brook murders. They were armed with fresh enthusiasm and, crucially, new tools. Advances in fingerprinting techniques allowed them to revisit latent prints taken from the victims and the barrels themselves. Facially reconstructing the unidentified victims also became more sophisticated, thanks to computer-assisted modeling. Investigators hoped these modern developments would spark interest from the public as new composite images of the victims made their rounds on local news broadcasts and online forums. Yet the results remained agonizingly similar. No one recognized the victims and no credible new tips emerged. Some experts theorized that the victims could have been from out of state or even from outside the country, making it less likely that anyone local would know who they were. Still, local authorities felt a renewed sense of determination. They consulted with forensic anthropologists, re-examined the victims' remains for any overlooked medical or dental clues, and shared details with other states' missing persons databases. The case, though grim, served as a rallying point for forensic professionals who believed that the right combination of science, communication, and persistence could finally lift the veil of mystery. Little did they know, a technological revolution was about to reshape the entire investigation. By around 2017, a promising method called genealogy began to make headlines. This powerful technique involved comparing DNA collected at crime scenes to data in public genealogy databases. Skilled professionals could then build out entire family trees, identifying shared ancestors and narrowing down the possible identities of otherwise nameless victims. For law enforcement agencies dealing with cold cases, this was nothing short of a game changer. In the Bear Brook murders, investigators seized upon this tool with unwavering resolve. They recovered DNA samples from the victims and submitted them to genealogy experts. Soon, painstaking research was underway to see if even the faintest genetic link could lead to living relatives. For the first time in decades, there was genuine optimism that these long-forgotten victims might finally reclaim their identities. It was a race against time and a test of scientific precision. Genealogists labored night and day, comparing DNA markers, exploring vast family trees, and double-checking every potential branch for inconsistencies. With each new clue, they drew closer to unlocking the secrets behind the 4 unknown individuals in those barrels. Ultimately, it was this perseverance backed by revolutionary DNA technology that would propel the Bear Brook murders from decades of unanswered questions into the realm of resolved cases, forever transforming how investigators approach cold files around the world. One of the most remarkable figures in the Bear Brook investigation was a dedicated genetic genealogist who found herself faced with a seemingly impossible puzzle. 4 unidentified victims, decades-old remains, and only fragments of DNA to guide the way. Undeterred, she immersed herself in this challenge, meticulously building extensive family trees from scratch. Each newly discovered branch or distant relative brought a glimmer of hope, fueling her determination. She combed through public genealogy databases, cross-referencing every DNA match, no matter how distant. Hours stretched into days and days into months as she painstakingly checked and rechecked potential family connections. Though traditional investigative methods had stalled, this revolutionary approach offered a spark of possibility. At times, the process felt like hunting for a needle in an ever-expanding haystack. But for this genealogist, every small lead was a promise of progress, one step closer to giving these unknown victims their names back, no matter how daunting the task. After months of methodical research, the genealogist made a breakthrough that would change everything. She announced the identities of 3 of the 4 victims, a woman named Marlyse Elizabeth Honeychurch and her 2 daughters, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters. For decades, they had been known simply as the unknown victims in the barrels, yet here they were at last real individuals with a family, a history, and identities that could now be acknowledged and honored. It was a bittersweet victory. Solving the mystery of 3 victims cast the remaining unidentified child in an even darker light, hinting at secrets that had yet to be fully unearthed. Investigators were both relieved and unnerved. On one hand, they could finally connect names to faces and reach out to any living relatives who might have been searching for answers. On the other hand, there was still a missing piece, a child whose name remained a question mark, implying that the scope of the tragedy might be larger than previously imagined. As the genealogist continued to piece together the victims' family lines, she discovered a chilling presence lurking in the background: Peder Rasmussen. Investigators quickly realized this man was no ordinary suspect. He had been known by an alarming list of aliases, among them Bob Evans, Curtis Kimball, and others. The more they dug into his past, the more they understood how he managed to elude law enforcement for so long. Evidence suggested Rasmussen had been involved in other missing persons cases, raising the terrifying prospect that the Bear Brook murders were part of a larger pattern. He seemed capable of slipping seamlessly into new identities, altering his appearance and personal details whenever suspicion drew near. With each revelation, the puzzle grew more complex, and yet it also offered clarity. A single perpetrator stood at the heart of the Bear Brook mystery, a killer who had hid behind fake names and broken lives for far too long. As I continued to follow the threads leading from Peder Rasmussen, I realized this case was bigger than anyone had suspected. Investigators traced him to a missing persons report filed on a woman named Denise Bowden, who vanished in the early 1980s. Even more disturbing was the fact that Rasmussen, under one of his many aliases, had been romantically involved with Denise before she disappeared without a trace. Rasmussen's pattern of deceit went far beyond using different names. He changed his appearance, moved states whenever trouble loomed, and provided false histories to anyone who questioned him. He was a chameleon, slipping between the cracks of multiple law enforcement databases, often because people were searching for a completely different identity. With each discovery, the question grew more pressing. Had Rasmussen left a trail of unsuspecting victims behind him, all hidden in the shadows of his fabricated identities? To understand the full extent of Rasmussen's crimes, investigators had to reconstruct decades of his life. They collected employment records, examined rental agreements, and interviewed people who crossed paths with this elusive figure. But time after time, the details just did not add up. One former employer remembered him by a different name. A distant neighbor recalled conflicting stories about his childhood. Every new layer uncovered a fresh contradiction. Eventually, a harrowing realization set in. The unidentified child found in the second steel barrel near Bear Brook was likely Rasmussen's own biological daughter. This single fact deepened the tragedy immeasurably, leaving me with more questions than answers. How could a father commit such an unspeakable act? What was his motive? Each revelation cast Rasmussen in a darker, more sinister light, and yet no one could fully explain his reasons for targeting Marlyse Honeychurch, her children, and potentially others. By this stage, the Bear Brook murders felt less like a single case and more like a series of interwoven mysteries. Authorities knew Rasmussen's real identity, they had identified most of the victims, and they had tracked his movements across multiple states. Yet the core questions remained excruciatingly out of reach. Why did Rasmussen zero in on Marlyse and her family? Was it an act of opportunity or something more personal? Adding to the unease was the possibility that undiscovered victims might still be out there, forgotten in far-flung jurisdictions where Rasmussen once lived under an assumed name. Were there more people who, like Denise Bowden, had vanished under suspicious circumstances around the same time frame? The investigation had come so far, but it still felt incomplete, as though the worst secrets were yet to come to light. If anything was certain, it was that the Bear Brook murders had peeled back only one layer of a deeper, more alarming reality, and no one knew just how deep that darkness ran. In the midst of unraveling the Bear Brook murders, investigators unearthed a string of other crimes tied to Peder Rasmussen. Under one of his many aliases, he had spent time in prison. In another instance, he was suspected in a murder in California, but managed to slip through the cracks by assuming yet another false identity. It was only after the DNA links to the Bear Brook victims came to light that the true depth of his criminal activity became clear. Piecing together his timeline revealed that Rasmussen drifted from state to state, taking up jobs in remote locations and living in transient communities. He blended effortlessly into new neighborhoods, never staying long enough for people to get suspicious. Each time law enforcement began to circle in, Rasmussen would shed his old persona and invent a new one. Until the Bear Brook case, few had suspected that one man could be responsible for so many unanswered disappearances and potential homicides. By the time the evidence solidified, it became obvious that the web of Rasmussen's deceit was as vast as it was tangled, complicating investigative efforts for decades. The Bear Brook murders stood as a shining example of how modern technology could resurrect even the coldest of cases. Where conventional investigations had stalled, genetic genealogy emerged as a revolutionizing force, offering a path to identify victims who were otherwise lost to history. By studying microscopic traces of DNA and comparing them to entries in public genealogy databases, the experts forged a connection that changed the trajectory of the entire investigation. Perhaps the most impactful element of this breakthrough was not just the identification of victims, but the ability to trace the killer's lineage as well. In Rasmussen's case, it revealed how his aliases and cross-country movements fit together in a way no traditional search could match. Soon, authorities across the nation began to realize the potential of this forensic tool. It ushered in a wave of renewed hope for a host of other unsolved disappearances, shining a spotlight on the incredible power of DNA to both restore names to the unidentified and bring long-time offenders to justice. Before long, the Bear Brook investigation was recognized as a landmark example in the field of DNA-based cold case resolutions. It served as proof that time does not always cloak a killer's crimes in darkness. No matter how carefully one might try to erase their tracks, no matter how many aliases they adopt, modern science can still push past decades of uncertainty. For families of missing persons, the Bear Brook story offered a renewed sense of hope. Many of these families had waited years, sometimes lifetimes, for any sign of what happened to their loved ones, clinging to faint whispers of possibility. Now, with the success of genetic genealogy on full display, they saw a clear pathway to answers, a chance that their own cold cases might one day be reopened and solved. While the Bear Brook murders were, at heart, a tragic tale, they also underscored a powerful truth science and unrelenting determination could ultimately prove stronger than any killer's desire to remain hidden. Once the details of the Bear Brook breakthroughs reached the public, media coverage skyrocketed. National news outlets, true crime podcasts, and documentary filmmakers all clamored for interviews and inside information, eager to share every twist and turn of the investigation. The idea of merging old school detective work with cutting edge forensic science enthralled audiences. In living rooms across the country, people discussed the bizarre nature of a killer who could hide in plain sight for decades, adopting new identities at will. Social media channels were soon alight with theories as amateur sleuths pored over every available scrap of information. Some speculated about additional victims, while others argued about whether Rasmussen had accomplices. The renewed focus on the case put pressure on local authorities to leave no stone unturned, fueling an ever-growing appetite for closure. Whether drawn by morbid curiosity or genuine concern, the nation collectively waited for updates, hoping each press release might finally unveil the last hidden secrets. By the time all eyes were on Bear Brook, Terry Rasmussen had already passed away in prison in the year 2010. Yet for the families of the victims and for the investigators who had devoted their careers to solving these murders, Rasmussen's death did not mark the end of their search for justice. There remained a deep need to piece together the victims' final days, especially those of Marlyse Honeychurch and her children. Despite the finality of Rasmussen's demise, law enforcement continued to chase down leads, interview anyone still alive who had known him, and gather fragments that might clarify exactly what happened. The goal was not only to solidify the criminal case, but also to give grieving relatives a chance to properly mourn their loved ones. Identifying the victims allowed family members to come forward, share memories, and finally lay them to rest with the dignity they deserved. Justice, in its most human sense, took shape in the form of remembrance and the collective promise never to let these victims become mere statistics. Today, those who learn about the Bear Brook murders often focus on the sensational aspects of the story: the elusive killer with multiple aliases, the use of groundbreaking DNA technology, and the decades-long mystery. But at the heart of this tragedy were real people: Marlyse, Marie, Sarah, and one child still unidentified, each with their own hopes, dreams, and stories left unfinished. In some ways, the greatest tribute to the victims is ensuring that their names are remembered, that they are not relegated to a mere footnote in true crime history. Their case symbolizes the resilience of those who refuse to let a cold case remain unsolved, and it reminds us that behind every breaking headline lies a deeply human story. By bringing these lost voices back into the light, the Bear Brook investigation stands as proof that no one is truly forgotten as long as we continue searching. While the Bear Brook murders are a haunting illustration of genetic genealogy's power, they are far from the only instance where DNA has cracked a seemingly unbreakable mystery. From identifying the remains of long-lost soldiers from past wars to apprehending notorious criminals like the Golden State Killer, this evolving technique has proven itself invaluable. Genetic genealogy bridges the gap between the distant past and the present day, linking minuscule DNA clues to expansive family trees that might stretch across continents. For many families, these breakthroughs are more than scientific triumphs. They are an end to sleepless nights and lingering fears. Whether it is a small detail that links a missing person to a living relative or a sophisticated analysis that reveals the identity of an unknown killer, DNA evidence offers closure where once there was only doubt. Thanks to this technology, numerous cold cases across the globe have been reopened, leading to convictions and ultimately to a sense of peace for those who have waited far too long for answers. So concludes the story of the Bear Brook murders, a case once overwhelmed by endless questions, now forever changed by modern-day science. Although Peder Rasmussen slipped through the cracks for a time, DNA technology ensured that the victims' identities were reclaimed, and his crimes did not vanish with him. This case stands as a testament to the tenacity of investigators and the relentless march of scientific discovery. But as you consider what happened at Bear Brook, ask yourself, how many other killers might still be hidden in plain sight, concealed by new identities or living on borrowed time? Will genetic genealogy continue to illuminate these dark corners, finally bringing justice to families who have gone too long without answers? Share your thoughts, theories, and questions, because sometimes a single insight can unravel the secrets that have stayed buried for far too long.